Hello, I'm Rosie Gosling, and in introduction to this unit, Principles of Sociology, you met Nigel Dodd. Nigel Dodd is the Academic Coordinator for Sociology on the External Programme at the London School of Economics. And in this video, we're going to introduce you to Marx and Weber. Now, in the introductory video, we talked about Durkheim, suggesting that individuals are like grains of sand. They don't matter. Society is what matters, and society constrains the individuals. So we want to now use Durkheim and use Weber to illustrate the aspects in chapters 3 and 4 of the subject guide, and particularly the idea of the social and society. Now, for Durkheim, society was something hard and could be measured, and it was very different from other sociologies that we've come across. And this is a very important division in sociology, and it's central. And we're going to discuss the ontological problems associated with the concept of society. Nigel, in the guide, we talk about a sociological perspective, and we talk about the sociological perspective. Could you explain how sociologists view the social, and how different is that from other social sciences?
The social, for a sociologist, is something that can't simply be reduced to an aggregate of what individuals do. So Durkheim uses the phrase, the social is society sui generis. Society has a reality in and of itself. So it's something which actually exists beyond and outside the individual. So for Durkheim, the social is something which exercises some sense of constraint over us. So the social is something that we feel to some degree compelled by, driven by, motivated by. The social is something which does have a life of its own beyond the lives of the individuals that make it up.
So the sociological perspective, in Durkheim's view, relates to his concept of society.
Yes.
But looking at it from the general sociological perspective, how do sociologists view the social world different from psychologists or historians?
Sociologists would always look for that aspect of the human world that stems from or can be explained by or contributes to our understanding of the social world. Sociologists would look beyond the level of the human mind, would look beyond the level of individual motivations, would always look for some sense of social structure, of social context, some sense that there is a level of reality, the social, which influences the way in which individuals act, the way in which they think, the things that they do, and the things that happen to them. So we're always looking beyond the purely the level of the individual. In addition, we're looking beyond dimensions of the world, like the economic dimension or the political dimension. The social dimension is, in a sense, that which encompasses all of those things, but that relates specifically to the way in which individuals react, interact, and live together.
So that's a general perspective
Yes.
of the sociological perspective. But we know there are many different perspectives within sociology. The perspective is like a lens with which the sociologists view the world. How different is Durkheim's view of society or the social from other sociologists?
I think Durkheim's probably a fairly extreme version of sociology. For Durkheim, sociology begins with society, and the individual enters the picture only insofar as the individual is something created by society, shaped by society, conditioned by society, determined by society. So for Durkheim, everything begins at that level. There are other sociologists who disagree. For other sociologists, such as Weber, our mode of analysis should begin with the individual, and the individual is a member of society, but society is never something which is beyond the individual. So I think sociologists all broadly agree that there's something interesting about the social, but they disagree about where to begin. So broadly speaking, Durkheim begins from the social and works his way down to the individual. Weber starts with the individual and works his way up to the social. I would say that's probably the best way of thinking about that distinction.
So in Chapter 3, we introduce the students to the concept of ontology.
Right.
So if you would think about ontology in relation to Durkheim, how would you describe him in these words? What is his major assumptions? I mean, for example, was he a materialist or was he an idealist? You know, how did he view how change occurred?
Well, one of the distinctions that comes up in Chapter 3 is between materialism and idealism. And broadly speaking, what that means is that you get one bunch of sociologists that regard history as being driven by the material world and depending on the material world. They're the materialists, and the other bunch of people tend to believe that ideas are the more important forces in history. I would argue that those distinctions are not meant to be hard and fast, that those we call materialists do also give some credence to the role of ideas and vice versa. Durkheim, I would say, is an idealist, first and foremost. For him, society is held together by a set of beliefs, a belief system, which he calls the conscience collective. I'm sure we can speak about that in a moment. So Durkheim's ontology is one which begins with a statement that society is something real, it's something which has an existence of its own in its own right, and an existence which cannot be reduced to its constituent parts.
Hence he's been described as a holist.
Yes, exactly.
Absolutely. And Weber, at the extreme, would probably be considered to be an idealist in relation to others.
Yes, I mean, with Weber, the key distinction with Weber is to put him up against Marx. And whereas for Marx, social change is driven by class relations and by the way in which the economy works and so on. For Weber, change can happen because of transformations in religious belief, for example. So ideas with Weber can be a force for social change, and that's why he tends to be called an idealist. But as I say, those distinctions aren't hard and fast, they're not absolute.
And it's really important for students to remember this, because they tend to put people in little boxes. So I think, Nigel, thank you very much for reinforcing that. Could we take some ideas of Durkheim in terms of the things you mentioned, the collective consciousness, the things like treating society as sui generis, and can we look at it in terms of his key work, suicide?
Well, if you think about suicide, it's a quite remarkable study. Here's Durkheim, who at the time is still working hard to establish sociology as a scientific discipline. Moreover, he's trying to show and to demonstrate that sociology is not only an independent discipline, but possibly is the most important discipline of all the social sciences. So sociology should have priority over psychology, over history, over economics, over politics.
Just like Comte.
Just like Comte. And so he chooses what we sometimes call the hardest possible case. Just think about it. If there's one thing, one phenomenon that is most difficult to explain socially, it would be an entirely isolated act, the act of suicide. You'd think that suicide was exactly that which cannot be explained socially. Suicide is something which is isolated, can seem to be random, which is entirely a psychological event, a psychological cause. And Durkheim takes suicide and says, I think I can explain this phenomenon as social. I think it's a reflection of the social. I think it's an expression of levels of social solidarity and social regulation. And I think, moreover, and this is the really radical thing that he said, suicide has a pattern. Suicide has a predictable rate in different societies from year to year to year. Suicide is something which is as social as, for example, the crime rate. And I think that's an incredibly radical thing to have tried to do.
So suicide rate and crime rate are social facts?
Yes, exactly. They're social facts. They have a kind of reality, again, that's beyond the individual. They're pattern, they're regular, they're all the kind of criteria of social facts.
Now take something that's happening at the moment. We have sort of suicide bombers that are happening.
Yes.
Now, that I would think you could describe in terms of the social facts, the social things in the society. Is this not an individualistic act? Or is it a social act? Or is it a political act?
I think Durkheim would take the instance of the suicide bomber and he would try to make it fit with his typology of suicide. So, and the crucial thing is, for Durkheim, suicide is a psychological event. He doesn't deny that. It is a decision made by an individual, but it's made in conjunction with a certain set of social circumstances. And he constructs this typology. So some forms of suicide are a result of a person's under-integration in the group. So an individual can feel isolated from social life, can feel alienated, can feel very alone. And suicide is a response to that position within the social group. Some forms of suicide are a result of over-integration, of someone being too sewn up into the group so that their own sense of individualism, their own individual destiny appears secondary to the destiny of the group, to the fate of the group. And the famous example of that would be the suicide bomber, the kamikaze in the Second World War, for example. And I guess Durkheim would want to look at suicide bombers in those terms.
So that individuals cannot see themselves outside the group.
They see themselves as so much part of the group that, in fact, they see the group as larger than them and is more important than them, so their own individual fate becomes insignificant in relation to the group.
So society is so generous, is over and above the individuals in this case?
Over and above, in this case, overwhelmingly over and above, almost pathologically over and above.
So these are grains of sand, literally, to be wafted in the breeze?
Yes, literally grains of sand, and to almost to the point that there's something wrong here. He would say, I mean, he does say quite often that it's possible for society to be over-regulated, over-integrated, for it to go too far. And this would be one instance where he would say, yes, suicide in this form of suicide is an expression of, a reflection of, a pathological degree of integration. Pathology is a sickness. It's society's not well. There's something wrong with a society in which there is this kind of suicide. So
that means the idea of the pathological society rather than the well society is also very much part of Durkheim's typology about the dualism between pathology and normal, pathology and well.
Yes. Durkheim had this fascinating analogy, which it's interesting to explore it. Whether it works, we can argue about, but he likens the sociologist to the doctor. The sociologist is able to diagnose the sociologist knows the normal body, the healthy body, and one of the jobs of the sociologist in a modern society is to diagnose the sick body. The body here is society. And so the sociologist can identify why society has too much integration or too little integration, for example, too much regulation or too little regulation. And the sociologist can contribute to ways of explaining what's going on and to ways of, in a sense, finding a cure for that.
So this is a biological analogy again?
Yes, it is. It's exactly the biological analogy. And it's a controversial one, but I think it's also an interesting one to look at the sociologist as being like your doctor.
Can I just take the idea of collective consciousness again? The idea that the moral regulation that society has at a particular time can actually constrain individuals. Could you give us some examples of that in operation?
Well, I think the famous one that Durkheim thinks of is he says, I'm not only an individual, I'm a husband, I'm a brother, I'm a student, I'm a worker, I'm a friend. If you think about your everyday life, and you think about the things that you do in your everyday life and the roles that you fulfill, then those roles come with certain expectations. Think about just the way that you carry yourself through social situations. Think about how you queue for your lunch in the canteen, or where you'll sit on the bus or on public transport. All these things involve you internalizing and reproducing certain kinds of expectation about what the right kind of behaviour is. And these are examples of the way in which the conscience collective operates. They're ways in which we feel, in some sense, constrained by the social. And a great way of understanding this is simply to break some of these expectations, to jump in front of the queue when you go for your lunch, or to sit on someone's lap on public transport.
Yeah.
All of these things can show how actually social life is full of these kinds of expectations, and this is Durkheim's conscience collective, I think.
And actually breaking those rules is what students will come across again when they study
Garfinkel.
methodology in Garfinkel, which is showing you how the connection is there. So really, in Chapter 1, we look at socialisation, and this material that Nigel's been talking about can be used very effectively there particularly in relation to Talcott Parsons, which follows on directly from Durkheim in this case.
Yes, it does. I mean, one of the things that Durkheim's been called, he's been called many things over the years, is the father of functionalism. And he's called this precisely because Durkheim gives us this large unit of analysis, society, and he draws attention not to the individuals within society, but to the institutions within society and to the functions fulfilled by those institutions. And of course, it's not too far to get from Durkheim to a fully fledged theory of structural functionalism, which is, of course, what Parsons did.
When the anthropologists came in.
That's right.
The anthropologists had to come in here. Now, let's switch. How different is that from Weber? Because we're talking about society as a whole, whereas Weber talked about society as an aggregate of individuals. Can you just explain a little bit the differences between Durkheim and Weber in their approach to the social?
Yeah, in one sense, the difference is vast. As I've said already, Durkheim starts with society and with the social. Weber starts somewhere else entirely. For Weber, you begin with what he calls social action, with the individual acting in relation to others. So everything in Weber begins at the level of the individual and the meaning the individual gives to their behavior, to their action. So you could say, very, very simplistically, but it does work, Durkheim's approach is top-down. He starts from society and works his way down. Weber's approach is bottom-up. He starts from the individual and he works his way up. And everything that's social in Weber is made up of individuals. So the firm, the market, all the kind of institutions, the state, the bureaucracy, all the institutions that Weber talks about are ultimately institutions made up of individuals. And that's where his analysis always starts. So in one sense, in a very simplistic way, they're opposites, complete opposites.
Weber and Durkheim were writing pretty much at the same time. Weber was writing in Germany, Durkheim was writing in France, a little earlier. But they were very close, and actually Durkheim could be said to be writing in Germany because of the changes of the border. Why are they so different? Why do they have this completely different idea of the social?
I think there are lots of different ways of explaining that. Certainly you could, for example, look at the intellectual influences that each had. Weber was very much coming out of an engagement with economics, for example. Durkheim's background was more law, I think. But even more interesting is they were both interacting with and responding to very different national debates in France and Germany that were being held at the time. Durkheim is fascinating on this. He was, in many ways, responding to a crisis of confidence in France at the turn of the 20th century. In one sense, there was a debate going on in France between, you could call them the conservatives or the traditionalists on the one hand, and the modernizers, or Durkheim sometimes called the economists, yes, on the other. And when he used the word economists in this sense, it wasn't terribly nice. And very broadly, the economists felt that France wasn't modernizing fast enough. They felt that the individual needed to be given more room, and that there needed to be more individualism in France, and more of a marketplace, more of an economic outlook. And the traditionalists wanted a return to a more kind of collectivist existence.
Romanticism.
There was a sense of it, you could argue, and Durkheim really was standing between these camps and saying, well, look, there is truth on both sides, and his very specific notion of the social was geared to fleshing that difference out. And Durkheim's great discovery was this paradox. And the paradox was quite simply that he was saying society is a more modern, more individualistic place, but its individualism is a product of society. And that's what makes the social such a powerful notion in Durkheim. So we are a more individualistic world, but that the sense we have of the individual, the sense we have of the individual's outlook and economic behaviour is a product of social changes and comes from there. So for Durkheim, society is a more individualistic place, but it doesn't mean that society has ceased to be important. In fact, it's more important, and it accounts for that. Weber was different. Weber had a different set of concerns. And his concerns were more really about the extent to which Germany could again undergo modernization, but without losing a sense of values. And by and large, Durkheim's work was informed by an ambivalence towards the decline of religious belief. Much of his work, Protestant Ethic, for example, that famous study, many people see the Protestant Ethic as an analysis of the causes of capitalism, as a direct rival to Marx. But there's another story in there, and I think the more interesting story is its analysis of what might happen to modern culture if our sense of values, our sense of religion declines, and if we become more and more concerned with a certain kind of rationality that he describes as instrumental rationality. So again, Weber's responding to a different set of debates, and I think this reinforces the point that I would always make, that sociology is meant to be engaged with the world that it's part of. It's not simply a dry, theoretical, academic subject. Much of what happens in sociology is a direct response to what's going on in the world around us. And if you look at the differences between Weber and Durkheim, some of those differences can be accounted for. Some of their arguments can be accounted for by the debates that were taking place in. Both were men of their time, so not just dry, abstract theorists.
So really a sociology of sociology.
Totally, yeah.
I
think it's important. Yeah, make these people real. You know, Durkheim and Weber were real men, really engaged in history, and it's important not just to see them as these abstract figures.
And this is important when you write your essays and write your answers to Section A. Please don't simply put little people into little boxes and say these are this and this is that. Make them real. Make sure you've read the work so you can actually answer questions and use it creatively, exactly as Nigel suggested. You cannot simply say Weber is an idealist, Durkheim is a structuralist. You have to explain why and give some more expression to their real lives rather than simply answer questions in this way. So thank you, Nigel, for that. It's really important. We're looking at now the concept of structure and agency. Now, these are difficult concepts for students.
Right.
We've probably suggested that Durkheim talks in terms of structure, and Weber talks about in terms of meaning. You've said meaning in terms of we have to understand people's action by individuals will attach meaning to that action. And sometimes that's used as agency. These are difficult. There's a difficult dualism. Could you explain that, please?
Yeah, the structure agency has become a shorthand that sociologists use to describe what they think is one of the major theoretical debates that took place in sociology during the 20th century. And structure agency makes it, I think, sound rather more complicated than it is. It's not complicated. In essence, it's society versus the individual. What carries more weight? If you want to explain crime, if you want to explain divorce, if you want to explain anything that goes on in society, where do you begin? What do you give most emphasis to? Do you give more emphasis to structure, society, or more emphasis to the individual? Most sociologists, in fact, if you ask them, will say, well, the truth is between the two. So the way in which we set this up, a structure versus agency, doesn't really work in practice. Most practicing sociologists will say, well, actually, there's a bit of both. Now, if you want to explain certain differences in crime rates between London boroughs, partly it's to do with structural conditions, with housing, with family structure, can even be the basic urban geography of these places. Some of it will be to do with the kinds of individuals that move through, and some changes in crime rates will be a consequence of that. So I think most sociologists would say, look, we need to give room for both in our explanations. But so structure agency is a way of thinking about these issues theoretically in much more abstract terms, but don't make it too complicated. It really is just society and the individual and how they interact and the various ways in which sometimes society seems to carry more weight and sometimes the individual seems to carry more weight.
And surely the interplay between the two.
Exactly, that's the crucial thing. When do they interact and how do they interact? At which points does the individual become a highly socialised individual? At which points does the individual's behaviour are really affected by society, and at which points are they not? And I think, and what mediates that relationship? Schooling, education, family, media, authority, firms, organisations, all those levels at which the individual comes into contact with the social. So yeah, we're concerned with the interaction between the two. And I think it would be a crazy sociologist that would say, well, it's all about society and never about the individual. And a crazy sociologist that would say the opposite. And I think neither Weber nor Durkheim would go into those extremes. Both we're inclined to either extreme, but we're actually trying to find a balance between them.
Good. So Weber's often described as social action theorist, as the social action. Now the difference is when you're coming to the 20th century, we look at symbolic interaction, interactionism, which shows the dynamism very strongly. And in terms of sociology, we look at that interplay and we actually measure the processes and we talk about the processes of interaction. And therefore, it could be wrong to say, wouldn't it, that Weber was an interactionist, but he's much more an action theorist? Or would you actually suggest that he could be considered an interactionist?
I don't think one would go quite so far as to say that he was interactionist, but nevertheless, he sets things up in such a way that you could get to interactionism. The key with Weber is that action has a meaning which is social. So if you want to understand, so take a very basic piece of action that takes place. Imagine that somebody every single morning on their way to work decides to go and sit on a bench for 5 minutes and watch the traffic go by. What's that got to do with anything? One could argue that it's a regular piece of behaviour. So what's the explanation? Weber would say, well, sorry, you can't explain that piece of action really unless you ask the individual what it is they think they're doing, unless you try to understand the meaning that they give to their piece of regular behaviour. So, but on the other hand, and this is crucial, Weber would say, the explanation they give you isn't necessarily the right one. So you need to take account of meaning, and the word he uses, the German word he uses for that is verstehen. So every action has a meaning. You need to take account of that meaning. You can't simply regard the individual as some sort of automaton or robot. So I think that that's the crucial thing with Weber and social action and meaning.
So you have to interpret that action in some way.
Always, yes.
And in terms of you interpret it, Weber had a sort of model about different forms of action where he placed particular actions in those contexts. So
yeah, well, take the guy sitting on the bench every morning. He could be sitting there because he's not very fit, because it's too far to walk, and he has a pair of malfunctioning lungs and needs to have a sit down. It could be that the bench is opposite the apartment of a woman he's in love with. That would be
romantic,
a very different way of explaining his behaviour. It could also be that the bench is next to some place where he wants to buy, and he's sort of working out what price to give it. So there could be all these different ways of understanding action. And what Weber does is he provides us with a typology of action, 4 kinds of action that correspond to different possible explanations or ways of understanding. So one is that it's rational in various ways. Another would be that it's an emotional action. The other reason this guy is sitting on the bench might be that he belongs to a religious sect. And in this religious sect, it's the done thing that for 5 minutes every morning you have to sit down and meditate. And it happens to be that he's next to this bench when he needs to do this. So that's a different kind of meaning. And it's the same action, different meanings.
So you can categorise action according to that typology.
Yes, absolutely.
Nigel, we've explained, and you've explained, that Durkheim and Weber have very different views of the world. And therefore, in terms of determining how they look at the world, how they actually investigate the world, they'd have different methodologies. For example, Weber would have interpret the world, whereas Durkheim would start to count it, start to measure it. Could you explain those divisions, please?
Yes, broadly speaking, because I wouldn't want to overemphasise the difference between these thinkers and to say that they're absolutely opposite extremes. And as I keep saying, most practising sociologists, most of my colleagues here at the LSE would want to take a bit of Durkheim sometimes, a bit of Weber sometimes. They'd want to mix. But broadly speaking, if you follow the logic of their positions, then Durkheim would lead you into a form of analysis which tries to take a view of the whole, which is why we call it holistic. Tries to take a broad view of what's going on within society. And in order to do that, fundamentally, the first thing you have to do is to count, to find out who's doing what to whom, how often, when, where, and so on. And that, of course, leads to a number of different methods. The obvious one would be quantitative methods, questionnaires, surveys, and so forth. So, for example, the study of suicide is based on an analysis of suicide statistics from different countries, where he just looks at the rates of suicide in one country compared to another country, and he takes an analysis of those rates. And the rates are what he would call social facts. A social fact is something which is repeated, which has, if you like, a reality outside of the individual. And very famously, Durkheim said, treat social facts as if they were things. Treat them as if they were rocks and stones or whatever, phenomena of nature. Or grains of sand. And manipulate them in that way. So he's looking for patterns. Weber is looking to understand the meanings we give to individuals, meaning we give to our own actions. And because of that, we have to ask individuals how they interpret their actions. So you go back to my example of the guy sitting on his bench every morning. It's not enough to count the number of times he does that. It's not enough to measure the number of minutes he does that for. It's not enough to work out where he's doing it, where the bench is in relation. All of those things might be relevant, but first we have to ask him, why are you doing this? Why do you think you're doing that? And in order to do that, you need to involve interpretive techniques. And by and large, those will be interviews, and particular kinds of interviews that ask people to reflect on the meaning of what they're doing. And this, broadly speaking, leads to a variety of methods we call qualitative methods which try to explore the meaning of social life. Now, these two extremes, qualitative and quantitative, cover a whole multitude of different types of method. Again, I wouldn't want to overemphasize the degree of opposition between them. And again, I'd want to say that here at the LSE, and I'm sure elsewhere, most practicing sociologists would argue that you need a combination of both. And I think that both Durkheim and Weber, to some degree, would argue this. So broadly speaking, there are these two kinds of methods, qualitative, quantitative, survey, qualitative interview, but ideally we would use both.
So using qualitative research strategies and quantitative research strategies, which have different methods attached to these.
Yes.
And we'd obviously use both. And in sociology, we call that triangulation.
Yes, exactly.
And that is very clear in Chapter 2. And you can't just use one. But really, these polar opposites in some ways. Durkheim did think you could take statistics as being social facts, whereas the interpretivists and others would say, look, statistics are socially constructed.
Yes.
And I think that's an important difference, that we can't take them as certain facts. So we need to say people have to report suicide. Action has to be taken after that suicide. And that's one of the things you look at in Chapter 3. I take back to Weber. I mean, Weber didn't interview very many people. I mean, Weber didn't sort of sat and sort of looked at documents and looked at how documents could be interpreted. I mean, we talk about that in terms of hermeneutics, that actually you have to interpret the writings of Abraham Lincoln and people like that. Is that exactly how he did it? Or
well, yes, I mean, the Protestant Ethic, which is the famous study that he wrote, I don't think it's his most important, and I think it's important to see the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism in the context of a lot of other studies of the world religions, for example. But one of his main sources in the Protestant Ethic were diaries, the diaries of Benjamin Franklin. So yes, I mean, Weber couldn't necessarily, he couldn't interview the people he was talking about. I do remember reading an essay once where a student said that Durkheim interviewed suicide victims.
Yes, very good.
One of my favourites.
Or the other one, he actually went to ancient China.
Yes. So there are limits to what one can do, and clearly one can't interview certain categories of people, such as dead people. So in those instances, you try and get hold of social meaning in other ways. But certainly documents, archives, policy documents and so forth, they're all ways in which one can try to get at social meaning, and not simply through interviewing people.
So the idea is interpretation of that meaning.
Always, yes.
Always is important in that way. All right, I'd like to take a very, very important sociologist writing in the States in the 20th century, who was influenced by both Durkheim and Weber, Talcott Parsons. He came to the school in the 1970s. He was very involved in the development of sociology, particularly the sort of sociology we call positivistic sociology. But he's been described as a structuralist and a social action theorist. In effect, he described himself as both those. Can you explain that? Because I think it's very relevant to what we've just been talking about. Yeah,
I think the first explanation for it is longevity. Parsons did live an awfully long time, bless him. But he was addressing fundamentally the problem of structure agency, as we've described it, through most of his career. His first major contribution to that debate was published in 1937, and his last major contribution to that debate was published in the 1970s. So you're talking 40, 50 years of a man trying to resolve a fundamental problem of sociology. The other thing that Parsons was doing, which I think is important, is he was bringing classical sociology to America. It was Parsons that was translating Weber and Durkheim and all these guys. It was him that was bringing this European sociology into the States and laying it out and trying to sort out its problems. So why do we call him both an action theorist and a systems theorist or a structural theorist? For the simple reason that he was both. Parsons started out by theorizing sociology, theorizing society from something he called the Unit Act. His earliest work was called The Structure of Social Action. And in that early work, taking his cue from Weber, in fact, Parsons tried to argue that you can theorize society through an analysis of the actions that make it up. He decided that didn't work. And his next step was to try to work out the level of social norms, social values. And so he kind of raised his level of analysis a little. His last work, his later work, was much more to do with the social system, where everything begins with this big thing called the social system. And from there you talk about its different structural functions, you talk about its functional prerequisites. You talk about the Agile schema, AGIL, which I'm sure some students are already looking at or will read about. So in the end, Parsons ended up sort of at the opposite end of the spectrum. He ended up as a fully fledged structural functionalist or systems theorist. And actually that's what we largely associate him with. We associate him with the social system. We associate him with the work that he did from the 1960s onwards. But lots of people forget that earlier on, Parsons was much more in tune with Weber than with Durkheim.
Yes, so he moved from a Weberian perspective much more to a Durkheimian one.
And I think the fact that he moved tells us something, that he didn't find satisfaction wherever he went. He couldn't resolve these problems.
And students should remember that also Freud was highly influential in his work. So that I think he was not just as two sociologists, but this idea of understanding why people acted within that Unit Act.
Yes, and Parsons was, one could argue, Parsons was the ultimate synthesist. He was trying to pull in all the different kinds. I mean, for Parsons, the ultimate theory for Parsons would be a theory that takes in all of these factors that we've talked about. So the ultimate sociology for Parsons would be a sociology that has Durkheim, has Weber, has a bit of Marx, has Freud, has all these different levels of analysis. In fact, Parsons' real dream was a single social science, and in the 1960s, he co-authored, in fact in the 1950s I think, he co-authored with Neil Smeltzer, who's still alive, Economy and Society.
Yes.
And Economy and Society, with the whole conception of it, was this would be the beginnings of a unified social science that could take psychology, economics, politics. And if you look at Agile, the AGIL scheme, a part of that was for Parsons' attempt to say, okay, here's where economics fits the picture, here's where psychology fits the picture, here's where the study of culture fits the picture. He was trying to draw all these things in together and make them whole.
So the politics would be the goal setting, which is part of the politics.
Exactly. Economics would be the adaptation and so on and so forth.
That's interesting. It's very interesting. So really, Parsons was interpreting Weber and interpreting Durkheim.
Yes.
And therefore later people reinterpret it, like C. Wright Mills reinterpreted Parsons. So again, he's the subject of sociology himself.
Yes, he is,
So,
yes.
Now, students find it extremely difficult to read Parsons and extremely difficult to read accounts of Parsons. Is this normal?
And Parsons is extraordinarily difficult. There is a joke, which is that you can only understand him when he's been translated into German, and there's something to do with the German language there that seems to appeal to people. One of the things with Parsons is that he does use his own language. He creates this whole lexicon of words: adaptation, goal attainment, latent pattern maintenance. There's this whole language that seems very bizarre and extraordinary. And one could argue that a lot of this was a kind of an affectation, a way of making sociology look a bit more scientific.
Yes.
You know, we think of economics as being this terribly scientific discipline because it's got all these symbols and functions and so on, and it kind of looks good and it seems sort of esoteric. And Parsons was sort of doing this. And Parsons was also, you know, he was picking up from other sciences. So a lot of his work on the Agile schema, AGIL, was taken from cybernetics.
Yes.
So the big thing in the 1970s was the study of information systems. But I think, you know, if you're finding Parsons difficult, you know, you're probably reading him well. You know, he is difficult. It's not easy.
So the cybernetic hierarchy is particularly difficult, and students find it
It is
practically
difficult.
impossible.
Although once you've got it, you know, once you've sussed it out, once you've worked out what it means, once you've drawn it, and you can draw Parsons. That's one of the nice things. You can put him on a whiteboard, and you can say, "There's A, there's G, there's I, there's L." That's what these do.
Yeah.
And when I teach Parsons, I draw him.
Yeah.
Literally draw the thing, and once students get that, it's actually quite easy. Mm-hmm. It's much easier in some ways than thinkers that you can't draw.
Now, you mentioned something quite interesting about Parsons wanting to create sociology or the new social science as scientific.
Yes.
This is a sort of trend that's been going on since Comte. The idea to try and raise this way of thinking to the highest level. Probably politically it was important, but also through in academia. We needed to raise this way of thinking. And a lot of our work is often in contradiction to economics, saying, look, we have a way of looking at the world.
Yes.
Could you explain a little bit more about that? Because we are struggling in this way sometimes.
Yes, we are. I mean, in sociology has this, seems to have this legitimacy problem that sometimes it shares with other social science disciplines such as psychology. It's often forgotten that sociology began its life in a kind of ongoing debate with economics. There was an economics account of modernization, the Industrial Revolution, the emergence of markets and so on. Particular kinds of markets, I mean, not markets per se. And the sociologists, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, Comte, the others, came into this debate not by contradicting what the economists were saying straightforwardly. They weren't just saying you're wrong. They were saying, well, there are certain things that you're not thinking about enough, and that those things could actually contribute greatly to an explanation of our modern world. Durkheim's a key case in point, where he was accepting, broadly speaking, the argument that societies had become more complex in their division of labour, but was arguing that if that's all you say, then you can't explain how society itself is developing. You need reference to culture, to the conscience collective, to social solidarity, things that economists can't explain. So my argument on the relationship between sociology and economics would be quite simply that they are asking different but complementary sets of questions. That there need to be no contradiction between them necessarily. That they're just looking at different sides of the world in different ways.
And would you say the financial crisis that we're going through at the moment is quite an important way of thinking? You cannot detach culture in terms of expectations. You cannot detach economic issues from the social issues at the moment. And I think we're going back to understanding even the nature of risk has to be understood socially. Would you like to add something to
Yes,
that?
I think what's fascinating, what I find fascinating about the current financial crisis, and remember one of my specialisms is the sociology of money. So banks going bust is good business for me. And it's good business partly because when banks go bust, when markets collapse, when markets fail, when currencies die or dive in the way that they're doing, very often it's sociology or extra economic explanations that people look for. It seems that economics models are broken down, and so people come to sociologists, they come to sociologists, psychologists, they come to other social scientists to say, well, why is it that markets fail? Is it emotion? Is it a different set of values and so on? And I think I would say that sociologists have something to contribute to our understanding of the functioning of markets and money, whether they're doing well or they're not doing well. It's not simply in times of crisis that we come in. But I think times of crisis do show with particular clarity where social factors, cultural factors, political factors, psychological factors, and not just economic factors are important to the way in which these great institutions operate. So it's a very interesting time.
So men writing in the 19th century might have something to say what's happening in the 21st century at the moment.
Oh, totally. If you read Durkheim, Durkheim has some wonderful things to say about what goes on when markets are under-regulated. It's there. He's very clear. If you get an under-regulated market, you get this kind of effervescence of greed. It's there in Durkheim in black and white. So he would love what's going on now. He'd enjoy it.
Yeah. So it's important when you're asked about the contribution of early sociologists to see how it can be applied to society today. And it's not dead sociology. Sociology is always very dynamic and always sort of living in this sense. And I'd like to take one other living sociologist, very much living, Tony Giddens.
Yes.
And Tony Giddens, actually, I would like to finish on this because Tony looks at the idea of structure and agency through his concept of structuration. But he's done more than anybody else, really, to push the sociology to the forefront, particularly in his role as director of the London School of Economics.
Yes. Yeah, Tony was the man that supervised my PhD, so I go back some distance with him, but he first came to prominence as a sociologist in the late 1960s. And at that point he was interpreting the classics, rather like Parsons. But then his real breakthrough was in 1976 when he wrote a book called The New Rules of Sociological Method. And it's quite an ambitious title if you think that Durkheim's book was The Rules of Sociological Method, and then Giddens comes storming in and says, here are the new rules. But the new rules were effectively an attempt to create a sociology that gives equal space to the Durkheimian strain and to the Weberian strain, or to structure and to agency. So for Giddens, structure and agency aren't separate ways of explaining the social. They should be part of the same explanation of the social. And structuration theory, he himself admitted the word structuration is a very awkward word.
Not very beautiful.
It's not very beautiful. He said it probably sounds better in French, and it certainly does. But the reason he uses the word is to try to get at the notion that structure is not something static in society. It's something that's reproduced. It's so structuration is ongoing. It's a process. And the process is sustained by agency, by individuals. So Giddens' form of explanation in the 1970s into the 1980s is a way of trying to come up with a balanced conception of sociology. an overall sociology that doesn't simply bifurcate between the structuralists on the one side and the individualists on the other. The sociology that can genuinely give room for both. And I think it still stands as a momentous achievement.
So here's the link between Durkheim and Weber through to the 20th century into Tony Giddens, where you have this dynamism between these two very important concepts, structure and agency. James Coleman does the same thing, but in a more mathematical way.
Yes, he does, yes.
And I think it's important. But anyway, this particular debate is central, but we must be very careful not to have these polar opposites in sociology, and students must be very careful in writing their answers. They don't keep to these boxes and realise these individuals have effects themselves, that their people are still writing on the basis of their writings, but not as a positivist, not as a structural functionalist, not as an action theorist, but as individuals who are located in societies which are very different. I hope this has been useful for you. We started off this describing individuals as grains of sand. I hope in your studies you are no longer grains of sand and you're autonomous learners who will learn a lot. Thank you very much, Nigel.
Pleasure.